The name Borden was the iron fist of Fall River, a dynasty that controlled the city's banks and owned its downtown streets. Rising from the grim trade of coffin making, patriarch Andrew Borden built a multi-million-dollar empire defined not by luxury, but by a pathological frugality that bordered on madness. He forced his family to live like paupers in a house without running water, hoarding gold while starving them of freedom. But the silence of this self-imposed prison was shattered on a hot August morning in 1892. Andrew and his wife were found hacked to death, their faces obliterated by 19 blows of a hatchet. The prime suspect was not a stranger, but his own daughter, Lizzie, a Sunday school teacher who finally smashed the glass walls of her father's tyranny, proving that a house built on greed is destined to drown in blood. Growing rich from the dead. The foundation of the Borden dynasty was laid not in the bustling textile mills that defined the Victorian economy, but in the cold, quiet backrooms of the undertaking trade. To comprehend the pathology that would one day destroy the family, one must examine the specific nature of the money that built it. Andrew Jackson Borden, the patriarch, who would eventually die by the very violence he sought to repress, did not inherit his kingdom. He excavated it. Born into a withered branch of an old New England family, Andrew grew up in the long, cold shadow of poverty, watching his distant cousins thrive while his own father struggled to keep the hearth lit. This early deprivation carved a hollow space in his soul that no amount of gold could ever fill, instilling in him a terrifying, singular drive to accumulate wealth as a barrier against the chaos of the world. He began his professional ascent in the trade of death. As a young man, Andrew formed a partnership to create the firm Haynes and Borden, a company dedicated to the manufacturing of caskets and the management of funerals. In the mid-19th century, this was a visceral, tactile profession. Andrew spent his days handling the cold limbs of his neighbors, measuring their stillness, and calculating the profit margins on velvet linings and brass handles. He breathed in the scent of sawdust and formaldehyde, learning to view the human body not as a vessel of the spirit, but as inventory to be processed. This proximity to mortality stripped him of sentimentality. He learned that grief was a market, and that the dead were the only clients who never negotiated the bill. The wealth of the Borden family was thus born from the coffin maker's curse. Every dollar Andrew saved, every coin he placed in his lockbox, carried the weight of a final goodbye. He was known in Fall River not for his warmth, but for his terrifying efficiency. He would reuse screws. He would salvage wood. He would upsell a grieving widow on a mahogany box and then pinch pennies on the transport. This was not merely frugality. It was a form of psychological armor. Andrew believed that if he controlled the pennies, he controlled his fate. He was building a dynasty on the principle of contraction, spending nothing, saving everything, and trusting no one. The transition from undertaker to capitalist was driven by a ruthless hunger for tangible assets. Andrew took the profits from the funeral home, money literally earned from the grave, and poured them into the soil of Fall River. He began an aggressive campaign of real estate acquisition, targeting commercial properties in the heart of the downtown district. He possessed a predator's eye for weakness. When a local merchant stumbled, Andrew was there to buy the building. When a family needed to liquidate land to pay debts, Andrew was the buyer of last resort, offering hard cash at a discount. He did not buy these buildings to beautify the city. He bought them to extract rent. He became a landlord of biblical strictness, a man who treated his tenants with the same silent, icy detachment he had shown the corpses in his workshop. This accumulation of property marked the shift in the family's status. The Bordens were no longer just service providers, they were owners. They owned the Borden block, an imposing brick structure that housed offices and shops, standing as a physical monument to Andrew's climb from the gutter. He diversified into banking, eventually taking a seat at the head of the Union Savings Bank. The coffin maker had become the banker, the man who held the mortgages of the town's elite. By the time he reached his 60s, Andrew Borden was a titan of local finance, possessing a fortune that would be worth millions in the modern era. However, the dynasty he was building was fundamentally flawed. Most patriarchs build empires to elevate their families, to provide them with the luxuries and status that come with success. Andrew Borden built an empire to feed his own neuroses. He viewed his family, his first wife, and later his daughters Emma and Lizzie, not as the beneficiaries of his labor, but as potential leaks in his financial hull. He brought the atmosphere of the funeral parlor home with him. The house was run with the silence and austerity of a crypt. He imposed a regime of extreme thrift that bordered on abuse. Despite his immense wealth, the Borden family lived below the standard of their own tenants. This disconnect between the reality of their wealth and the squalor of their daily lives created a toxic dissonance within the family unit. Lizzie and Emma Borden grew up knowing they were the daughters of the richest man in town, yet they were forced to wear patched clothes and live in a house without modern comforts. They watched their father lend money to the city for grand public works, while refusing to install a flushing toilet in his own home. The coffin maker's curse was not a supernatural hex. It was the inheritance of a worldview that valued dead capital over living people. Andrew Borden was constructing a vault, dragging his family inside and locking the door from the inside, unaware that by sealing them in with his money and his madness, he was creating the conditions for an explosion that would shatter the very legacy he had spent a lifetime securing. The empire was built on death, and ultimately it would demand a return to its origins, squeezing the town for every penny. The metamorphosis of Andrew Jackson Borden from a local undertaker into the financial kingpin of Fall River was not a sudden event, but a slow, calculated calcification of his soul. If the funeral home was where he learned the value of $1, the streets of Fall River were where he learned how to weaponize it. The post-Civil War era in Massachusetts was a time of ferocious industrial expansion, a period when the textile mills were devouring cotton and spitting out smoke, turning the Taunton River black with dye and profit. While other men sought their fortunes in the deafening roar of the looms, Andrew chose a quieter, more predatory path. He understood that the mills could burn, the cotton crops could fail, and the workers could strike, but the land underneath them would remain. He took the capital accumulated from the dead, the grim harvest of his undertaking business, and began to pour it into the bedrock of the living city. He targeted the commercial arteries of Fall River with the precision of a surgeon. He did not buy land on speculation or whim. He bought it for control. The acquisition of the building that would become the A.J. Borden Building on South Main Street was a declaration of his arrival. This was not a modest shop. It was a brick-and-mortar fortress located in the absolute nerve center of the town's economy. By owning the commercial real estate, Andrew effectively became the landlord of the city's commerce. He collected rent from the merchants, the lawyers, and the shopkeepers who kept the town running. His relationship with the community shifted from that of a service provider to that of an overseer. He walked the streets not to greet his neighbors, but to inspect his assets, his tall, gaunt frame casting a long shadow over the tenants who scrambled to have their payments ready on the first of the month. The tenants quickly learned that Andrew Borden was a man devoid of mercy. In the ledger of his mind, a late payment was not a mistake. It was a moral failing. He managed his properties with a terrifying austerity. Repairs were made only when absolutely necessary to prevent structural collapse. Aesthetics were considered a wasteful indulgence. If a roof leaked, he would patch it with the cheapest tar. If a window broke, he would replace it with the thinnest glass. He squeezed every building for maximum yield, treating his real estate exactly as he had treated the caskets, sturdy enough to do the job, but cheap enough to ensure the margin. He was extracting the wealth of Fall River 1 month at a time, siphoning the liquidity of the town into his own private reservoirs. This accumulation of tangible assets provided the leverage for his ascension to the pinnacle of local power, the banking sector. Andrew Borden did not merely deposit money, he became the money. He took his seat as the president of the Union Savings Bank, a position that granted him the power of a feudal lord in a capitalist society. In 1892, a bank president in a mill town was not just an administrator, he was the gatekeeper of survival. He decided who received the loan to start a business, who got the mortgage to buy a home, and who faced foreclosure. Andrew sat at the head of the boardroom table, a figure of silence and gray wool, holding the economic destiny of thousands in his hands. The sheer scale of his wealth by the final year of his life is difficult to conceptualize without the lens of inflation. When Andrew Borden died, his estate was valued at approximately $300,000. In the economic context of 1892, where a factory worker might earn less than $1 a day, this sum was astronomical. Adjusted for modern economic power and purchasing parity, he was worth the equivalent of nearly $10 million. He was, by every metric, the richest man in the area. He possessed the resources to live in a mansion on the hill, the fashionable district, where the other textile barons built their Victorian palaces with manicured gardens and servants' quarters. He had the means to travel to Europe, to buy fine art, to fill his home with the warmth of gaslight and the luxury of indoor plumbing. Yet this is where the pathology of the Borden dynasty reveals its most twisted architecture. Andrew Borden had the power of a king, but he chose to live like a serf. He possessed a golden key that could unlock any door in the world, but he used it to lock himself inside a mental prison of scarcity. He owned shares in the Fall River Water Company. He literally owned a piece of the infrastructure that pumped clean water into the homes of the city. Yet he refused to install running water in his own house. He owned the gas company, yet he forced his daughters to navigate the dark hallways with kerosene lamps. He was a paradox that baffled and frustrated the elite of Fall River. They saw a man who had won the game of capitalism, but refused to claim the prize. The rumors that swirled around the Union Savings Bank described a man who derived no pleasure from his wealth, only a grim satisfaction from its possession. He was known to walk to work every single day, rain or shine, to save the few cents of a horse car fare. He would stoop to pick up a stray nail on the sidewalk, pocketing it for future use. He wore the same black morning coat until it turned green with age, indifferent to the whispers of his employees. This was not the eccentricity of a genius. It was the obsession of a hoarder. He was hoarding potential. He was hoarding safety. Every dollar unspent was a brick in the wall he was building against a phantom poverty that no longer existed. But the most dangerous aspect of this transition was how it altered his relationship with his own blood. As his net worth climbed into the stratosphere, his paranoia deepened. He began to view his family through the same lens he used for his bank customers. Are they assets or liabilities? His daughters, Emma and Lizzie, were grown women, spinsters in their 30s, who remained dependent on him for every ribbon and every meal. To a man who measured worth solely by financial output, They were non-performing assets. They consumed food, they required clothing, they occupied space, yet they generated no return. The banker began to resent the father. He controlled their allowances with a humiliating strictness, forcing them to beg for pocket change while he sat on a mountain of gold. The transition to tyranny was complete. Andrew Borden had successfully converted the labor of his youth into a financial weapon. He had conquered the real estate market and dominated the banking sector. He had won, but in doing so, he had transformed himself into a target. He did not realize that by hoarding the wealth of the city and denying it to his own household, he was creating a pressure differential that the walls of 92 2nd Street could not withstand. He was the president of the bank, but he was about to learn that there are some debts that cannot be paid with checks and some foreclosures that end not with a gavel, but with a blade. The tycoon had built his castle, but he had forgotten to feed the dragons he kept inside, millionaires in rags. If Andrew Borden's bank account was a monument to the Gilded Age, his home at 92 2nd Street was a relic of a darker, colder century. To walk through the front door of the Borden residence was to step out of the bustling, modernizing world of 1892 and into a time capsule of deprivation. The tragedy of the Borden women, Lizzie and her sister Emma, cannot be fully measured by the violence of their end, but by the slow, grinding misery of their daily lives. They were the daughters of a man worth millions, yet they lived in conditions that the poorest mill worker would have found stifling. Andrew Borden did not build a home. He constructed a penal colony for his own bloodline, a place where the punishment for being born was a life sentence of unnecessary squalor. The location of the house itself was the first insult. A man of Andrew's staggering wealth was expected to live on the hill, the fashionable elevated district of Fall River, where the Victorian mansions sat on manicured lawns, catching the fresh breezes off the bay. That was where the society lived. That was where the air was clean. But Andrew chose to keep his family in the flats, right in the choking heart of the business district. Number 92. 2nd Street was not a retreat. It was a strategic outpost. It was located just steps away from Andrew's bank and his rental properties, allowing him to save time and shoe leather. The house was surrounded by the noise of commerce, the rattle of wagons, and the soot of the city. The Borden women could not open a window without inhaling the dust of the street. They were trapped in the commercial zone, living above the shop in spirit, if not in fact, isolated from the peers they were supposed to socialize with. But the true horror lay inside the walls. By 1892, the world was changing. The miracle of electricity was lighting up the cities. Central heating was banishing the winter chill. Indoor plumbing was transforming hygiene. Andrew Borden had the capital to modernize his home instantly. In fact, he owned significant shares in the local gas company and the waterworks. He profited every time a neighbor turned on a tap or lit a burner. Yet in a display of miserliness that borders on pathology, he refused to install these amenities in his own home. The Borden house had no electricity. While the rest of the wealthy world basked in the glow of the incandescent bulb, Lizzie and Emma were forced to navigate their lives by the dim, flickering light of kerosene lamps. The smell of burning oil permeated the drapes and the furniture, a constant olfactory reminder of their father's cheapness. But the lack of light was a minor inconvenience compared to the lack of water. There was no indoor plumbing on the upper floors of 92 2nd Street. There was no bathtub. There was no shower. In the sweltering heat of a Massachusetts August, when the humidity turned the house into a kiln, the women had no way to bathe properly. They were forced to wash themselves from basins of water carried up from the kitchen pump, a labor-intensive ritual, that belonged to a bygone era. The humiliation of this existence was physical. They were wealthy women who could afford the finest perfumes in Paris, yet they lived in a house that smelled of sweat and stagnation because their father refused to pay for a pipe. The sanitary arrangements were even more degrading. The house relied on a water closet in the cellar, a primitive toilet located in the darkest, coldest part of the house. But for the women sleeping on the second floor, a trip to the cellar in the middle of the night was impractical. Therefore, the bedrooms were equipped with slop pails, chamber pots. Every morning, the daughters of the bank president had to perform the ritual of emptying their own human waste, carrying the buckets down the narrow stairs to the cellar to dump them. This daily walk of shame was a potent symbol of their status. Andrew Borden had reduced his family to the level of scullery maids. The stench of the slop pails in the summer heat was the smell of their captivity. It hung in the air, a silent, foul testament to the fact that Andrew valued the cost of a plumber more than the dignity of his daughters. The deprivation extended to the very food on their plates. Andrew Borden did not believe in waste, and he defined waste as anything that was thrown away before it was completely consumed, regardless of its state of decay. The kitchen was not a place of warmth and sustenance. It was a laboratory of frugality. The refrigerator was kept under lock and key, not to prevent theft by servants, but to prevent snacking by the family. Andrew controlled the consumption of food with the same rigor he applied to a foreclosure. The week leading up to the murders provides a nauseating example of this dietary regime. The family had been feasting, if one can call it that, on a giant roast of mutton. For days in the stifling August heat, the mutton was served, then reheated, then served again. It appeared as a roast, then as a cold cut, then as a stew, and finally as a broth. The meat turned gray and stringy, the fat congealed, the bacteria multiplied in the unrefrigerated air. Yet Andrew refused to throw it out. He forced the family to eat the rotting meat until they were physically ill. The Borden stomach trouble that plagued the household in the days before the murders was likely not poison, as some rumors later suggested, but simple food poisoning inflicted by a millionaire who would rather risk dysentery than waste a nickel's worth of old sheep. This environment created a psychological pressure cooker. Lizzie Borden was a 32-year-old woman. In the Victorian era, she was already considered an old maid, but she was trapped in a state of suspended adolescence. She had no money of her own. Andrew gave his daughters no allowance, only doling out small sums for specific necessities upon request. Lizzie had to ask her father for money to buy ribbons, for money to buy fabric, for money to buy a stamp. She was a grown woman forced to beg for pocket change like a child. This financial impotence was a leash that kept her tethered to the house. She could not leave. She could not travel. She could not marry a man of her own standing because she had no dowry and no way to host a suitor in a house that smelled of kerosene and unwashed bodies. The miser's prison was not just about the lack of physical objects. It was about the abundance of control. Andrew Borden locked everything. He locked the front door. He locked the back door. He locked the barn. He locked the pantry. He locked the desk. The sound of keys jingling in his pocket was the soundtrack of Lizzie's life. It was the sound of the warden making his rounds. He created a world where access to the most basic elements of life, food, heat, light, exit, was granted only by his permission. Lizzie tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught Sunday school. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She tried to project the image of the pious, wealthy daughter. But the strain of returning from a charity meeting to a house where she had to empty a chamber pot was fracturing her mind. She was living a double life, a lady in public, a prisoner in private. The neighbors whispered about Andrew's stinginess, but they couldn't see the full extent of the degradation inside the walls. They didn't see the moth-eaten carpets. They didn't see the cold mutton. They didn't see the way Andrew watched the coal scuttle to make sure no one used an extra lump of fuel. The house on 2nd Street was a place where time stopped and air stagnated. It was a vacuum where hope was slowly sucked out, replaced by a simmering, silent resentment. Andrew Borden believed he was being a prudent father, teaching his children the value of $1. In reality, he was teaching them to hate him. He was stripping away their humanity layer by layer, denying them the comfort, the privacy, and the dignity that their station demanded. He was compressing the atmosphere of the house until the air itself became explosive. He did not know that by locking every door and window to keep the world out, he was trapping something far more dangerous inside, a rage that was growing in the dark, fed by the cold mutton and the smell of the slop pails, waiting for the moment to shatter the locks forever. The war behind closed doors. The architecture of the Borden tragedy cannot be understood solely by looking at the father. One must look at the women who circled him like sharks in a small tank. While Andrew Borden was the architect of the physical prison, the psychological torture chamber was constructed by the women themselves. The dynamic within 92 2nd Street was a Cold War that lasted for nearly 3 decades, a slow-motion collision between two factions that were locked together by law but separated by a chasm of resentment. On one side stood the Borden girls, Emma and Lizzie, the blood daughters who believed they were the rightful heirs to the kingdom. On the other side stood Abby Durfee Gray, the woman who entered the house as a wife and died in it as a stranger. Abby Gray married Andrew Borden in 1865, 3 years after the death of his first wife, Sarah. In the practical, unromantic calculus of the 19th century, this was likely a merger of convenience. Andrew needed a housekeeper and a mother figure for his young daughters. Abby, a spinster in her late 30s with few prospects, needed security. She was a short, rotund woman, physically the opposite of her gaunt, skeletal husband. She was timid, docile, and by all accounts desperately wanted to be loved. She entered the marriage hoping to fill the void in the motherless home. Instead, she walked into a minefield. To Lizzie and Emma, Abby was never mother. She was an intruder. She was the other. From the very beginning, the relationship was defined by a deep, festering suspicion. The daughters, particularly Lizzie, viewed Abby not as a caretaker, but as a biological impossibility, a parasite attached to the host of their father's fortune. They watched her. They measured her consumption. Every dress Abby bought, every meal she ate was calculated by the daughters as a deduction from their future inheritance. In a house where every penny was pinched until it screamed, Abby's very existence was seen as an expense. The tension remained a simmering undercurrent for years, masked by the polite repressiveness of Victorian etiquette. But the fault line finally ruptured over the one thing that mattered most to the Bordens: real estate. The incident that turned the Cold War into an active conflict is known as the Whitehall Street Transfer. It began when Andrew, in a rare moment of generosity or perhaps under pressure from his wife, decided to gift a house. He purchased a property on Whitehall Street and placed the deed in the name of Abby's half-sister. He did this to provide a home for Abby's family, a gesture of support for his wife's kin. To a normal family, this might have been seen as an act of charity. To Lizzie and Emma, it was a declaration of war. When the daughters discovered the transfer, the reaction was absolute and terrifying. They did not see a gift, they saw a theft. In their paranoid calculus, money was flowing out of the Borden reservoir and into the Gray reservoir. They believed that Abby was slowly manipulating their father, whispering in his ear, maneuvering to siphon off the estate so that her own family would inherit the fortune that Lizzie and Emma had suffered for. The rumor engine of the household went into overdrive. The sisters confronted their father, their rage so palpable that the stoic banker was forced to retreat. To buy peace, Andrew attempted a transactional solution. He essentially bribed his own daughters. He transferred the title of the grandfather's house on Ferry Street to Lizzie and Emma, a counter gift designed to balance the ledger. But the damage was done. The transaction proved to the daughters that their father's love was negotiable, and more importantly, it confirmed their worst fear. Abby was an active competitor for the gold. They accepted the house, but they did not accept the peace. In fact, they later sold the house back to their father for cash because they couldn't be bothered to manage it, preferring the liquidity of money they could hoard over the responsibility of ownership. After the Whitehall Street incident, the atmosphere in the house shifted from chilly to glacial. It was at this moment that Lizzie Borden performed a verbal amputation that resonates with forensic significance. She stopped calling Abby mother. For over 20 years, she had used the maternal title. Now she formally switched to Mrs. Borden. It was a linguistic knife, severing the familial bond. When a servant asked her about her mother, Lizzie would snap, "Do not call her that. She is not my mother. She is a mean old thing." This was not teenage rebellion. Lizzie was a woman in her 30s. This was a calculated dehumanization. By stripping Abby of her title, Lizzie reduced her to the status of an employee or a tenant. She was no longer family. She was the fat woman who lived upstairs. The house was then physically partitioned. The dining room, once the center of the Puritan family unit, became a battleground. The daughters refused to eat with the parents. They would wait until Andrew and Abby had finished their meal and left the room before they would descend to eat the cold leftovers. The sound of silverware scraping on china in silence became the soundtrack of the home. If they passed each other on the narrow stairs, skirts would be pulled in tight to avoid physical contact. They existed in the same square footage, breathing the same stagnant air, but living in parallel universes. Lizzie took the segregation a step further. She fortified her bedroom. The layout of the house was peculiar. It lacked hallways on the second floor, meaning rooms connected directly to one another. To ensure that Mrs. Borden could never walk through her room, Lizzie moved a heavy desk against the door that connected her bedroom to her parents' room. She sealed it shut. She then installed iron hook locks on the other doors. She created a fortress within the fortress. She was locking herself in, but she was also locking Abby out. The physical contrast between the women added a layer of grotesque resentment. Abby was morbidly obese, weighing over 200 pounds at the time of her death. In the sweltering heat of the unventilated house, her size made her suffer. She moved slowly, breathing heavily as she climbed the steep stairs. To the slender, rigid Lizzie, Abby's physical bulk likely represented her gluttony. She was a woman who consumed. She took up space. She took up air. She took up money. The stepmother was viewed with a clinical disdain, a fleshy obstacle that stood between the spinster and her freedom. Abby, for her part, retreated into a shell of passivity. She must have felt the hatred radiating from the spare rooms. She stopped inviting guests. She stopped trying to mother the girls. She became a ghost in her own home, spending her days dusting the furniture that wasn't hers and eating the mutton that Andrew refused to throw away. She was trapped. She had married a millionaire to escape the fear of poverty, only to find herself locked in a house where she was despised by the children and controlled by a miserly husband. She had food and shelter, but she was spiritually starving. The rumor engine suggests that in the final days, the paranoia reached a fever pitch. Lizzie suspected that Andrew was planning to write a new will. The fear was that the intruder would get everything. If Andrew died without a will, the estate would be split between the widow and the daughters. But if he wrote a will, if Abby whispered the right words, the daughters could be cut out. The shadow of the gold digger loomed large in Lizzie's mind. Every time Abby went to the bank with Andrew, Lizzie wondered if papers were being signed. Every time they spoke in hushed tones, Lizzie wondered if her future was being erased. The tragedy of the house divided is that it was a conflict fueled entirely by projection. There is no evidence that Abby Borden was a schemer. By all accounts, she was a simple, limited woman who just wanted a comfortable old age. She was not Lady Macbeth. She was a housekeeper with a ring. But in the airtight, overheated incubator of 92 2nd Street, reality didn't matter. Lizzie invented a villain because she needed a target for her misery. She couldn't hate her father. He was the source of the power. So she channeled all her rage onto the proxy. Abby became the vessel for every frustration in Lizzie's life. The fact that Lizzie was 32, unmarried, jobless, and trapped, was all blamed on the existence of the stepmother. As the summer of 1892 grew hotter, the silence in the house became deafening. The locks were clicking shut. The meals were eaten in solitude. The word mother had been erased from the dictionary. The spinster sat in her room, staring at the barricaded door, listening to the heavy footsteps of the stepmother in the room next door, and perhaps realizing that as long as that heart kept beating, the inheritance would never be safe. The house was not big enough for both of them. One of them was a Borden by blood, and the other was a Borden by paper. And, in the primitive logic of the dynasty, paper burns, but blood remains. What dark thoughts hide behind the face of a Sunday teacher? To the casual observer walking down 2nd Street in 1892, Lizzie Andrew Borden was the very portrait of Victorian respectability. At 32 years old, she was a fixture of the community, a woman whose life seemed defined by piety and service. She taught Sunday school to the children of immigrants. She served as the secretary-treasurer of the Christian Endeavor Society. She was an active member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, campaigning against the evils of alcohol. Her public face was composed, her dress was modest, and her demeanor was quiet. But this image was a meticulously constructed mask, a porcelain shell hiding a mind that was slowly fracturing under the weight of a suffocating existence. The true Lizzie Borden was not the saint of the church. She was a prisoner of the house, a woman whose sanity was being ground to dust by the friction between her ambition and her reality. The psychological profile of Lizzie Borden is a study in the silent madness. She did not fit the archetype of the raving lunatic. She did not scream or tear at her hair. Her pathology was colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the madness of a glacier, slow-moving, crushing, and invisible until the moment it calved. The root of her condition lay in her status as a spinster. In the late 19th century, a woman of 32 without a husband was considered a social failure, a tragic figure destined to live on the charity of her male relatives. Lizzie was acutely aware of this stigma. She was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and possessed a hunger for the finer things in life. She dreamed of travel, of theater, of a home on the hill where she could entertain guests without the smell of the slop pails. But she had no means to achieve any of this. She was legally an adult, yet she was treated as a delinquent child. She had no career. She had no income. She had no agency. Her entire universe was controlled by the purse strings of a father who begrudged her the price of a new dress. This state of suspended animation created a profound dissociation. Lizzie began to separate her external actions from her internal desires. The rumor engine of Fall River, usually so focused on the father's greed, began to pick up static interference from the daughter's behavior. Long before the murders, there were whispers that something was wrong with Lizzie Borden. The most telling symptom was her kleptomania. It was an open secret among the merchants of downtown Fall River that the daughter of the bank president was a thief. Lizzie would walk into a dry goods store, her head held high, and browse the counters. When she left, small items would vanish: a spool of ribbon, a porcelain figurine, a piece of jewelry. These were not items she needed to steal for survival. She was the daughter of a millionaire. Nor were they items of great value. They were tokens. The stealing was a frantic, desperate attempt to assert control. In a life where she was allowed to own nothing, stealing was the only way she could acquire something on her own terms. It was an act of rebellion against the miserly tyranny of her father. It was a way to feel a rush of adrenaline in a life of gray monotony. It was a silent scream. The mechanism Andrew Borden used to deal with this is forensic gold. He did not punish her publicly. He did not get her psychiatric help. He handled it like a business transaction. When a shopkeeper caught Lizzie stealing, they didn't call the police, they called the bank. Andrew would quietly pay the bill for the stolen goods, instructing the merchants to put it on his tab and keep their mouths shut. He covered up his daughter's crimes with his checkbook, just as he covered up the rot of his house with cheap paint. He enabled her pathology because acknowledging it would have damaged the Borden brand. He taught her a dangerous lesson, that rules did not apply to her and that money could make any sin disappear. This entitlement bled into her interactions with society. Lizzie was known to be imperious and haughty. She demanded the respect due to a Borden, even as she lived in squalor. She corrected people who called her Lizzie, insisting on Miss Lisbeth. She forged a new identity for herself, changing her name on her calling cards to distance herself from the plain, dull Lizzie. She was trying to rewrite her own character, desperate to be seen as a woman of sophistication rather than the daughter of a coffin maker. But inside the house, the mask would slip. The servants described Lizzie's moods as volatile. She would go days without speaking, moving through the rooms like a phantom, refusing to acknowledge her stepmother or her father. These spells were periods of intense, brooding silence. She would lock herself in her room for hours, staring at the wall or rearranging her meager possessions. It was in these hours of isolation that the resentment crystallized. She sat in the heat, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the jingle of her father's keys, the heavy breathing of Abby on the stairs, and she began to view them not as people, but as obstacles. The silent madness is characterized by a lack of affect. Lizzie Borden could look at a person she hated and smile pleasantly. She could wish a person dead and then ask them if they wanted butter for their bread. This ability to compartmentalize is chilling. It suggests a mind that has severed the connection between emotion and action. She had learned to hide her feelings so deep that she likely couldn't access them herself. She was a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. There's a specific incident involving a dress that foreshadows the cold calculation of her mind. Lizzie had a dressmaker, Mrs. Raymond, come to the house. During the fittings, Lizzie would talk. She didn't talk about boys or parties. She talked about fate. She complained about her father's health, hinting darkly that he had many enemies and that she feared something was going to happen. She was planting seeds. She was writing the script of a tragedy before the curtain went up. She was preloading the narrative with the idea of an intruder, a tall man, a stranger who would come and destroy the family. This wasn't anxiety. It was rehearsal. The juxtaposition of the Sunday school teacher and the thief is the key to unlocking the crime. The jury would later look at Lizzie and see only the Sunday school teacher. They saw the Bible in her hand and assumed her heart was pure. They couldn't see the thief. They couldn't see the woman who felt entitled to take what she wanted without paying for it. They couldn't see that to Lizzie Borden, her father's life and her stepmother's life were just like the ribbons on the counter, things she wanted to remove, things she felt entitled to take because she had been denied so much for so long. Lizzie Borden was not crazy in the legal sense. She knew right from wrong. She knew the date and the time, but she was morally hollowed out. The years of living in the miser's prison, of emptying slop pails, of eating rotten mutton, of begging for pennies, had eroded her conscience. She had become a creature of pure need. The silent madness was a state of supreme narcissistic focus. She wanted out. She wanted the money. She wanted the house on the hill. And she looked at the two people standing in her way, the old man counting his coins and the fat woman dusting the furniture, and she realized that the only way to open the door was to remove the locks. By August of 1892, Lizzie Borden was a loaded weapon left on the kitchen table. She was calm. She was pious. She was helpful. She ironed her handkerchiefs. She read her Bible. And all the while, in the silence of her mind, she was sharpening the blade. The town saw a spinster. The mirror saw a slaughterer. A house built for murder. No walls, no way out. If the psychological tension within the Borden family provided the gunpowder, the physical architecture of the house on 2nd Street supplied the match. To the forensic eye, the residence at number 92 was not merely a passive backdrop for a double homicide. It was an active accomplice. The layout of the home was a spatial disaster, a labyrinth of locked doors and dead ends that enforced a terrifying intimacy upon people who despised one another. Andrew Borden had purchased the property not for its comfort, but for its proximity to his bank, and in doing so he forced his family into a structure that was designed to destroy privacy. The fatal flaw of the house lay in its reconfiguration. It had originally been built as a two-family tenement, designed to house separate households on separate floors. When Andrew converted it into a single-family dwelling, he did so with his characteristic refusal to spend money on structural changes. He removed walls, but failed to add the necessary arteries of a functioning home. The most glaring omission was the absence of a hallway on the 2nd floor. In a standard Victorian home, a corridor would allow a person to travel from a bedroom to the stairs without disturbing the other occupants. At 92 2nd Street, the rooms were linked like a chain. To get from the guest room at the front of the house to the back stairs, one had to walk directly through the master bedroom, where Andrew and Abby slept. To get from Lizzie's room to the dress closet, she had to pass the threshold of her parents' sanctuary. This layout obliterated the concept of personal space. Every movement was tracked. Every footstep was heard. A person could not use the chamber pot, cough, or weep without the sound vibrating through the thin walls of the adjoining rooms. For a family defined by hatred and suspicion, this forced proximity was psychological torture. Lizzie Borden, desperate for autonomy, responded to this architectural violation by turning her bedroom into a bunker. She moved a heavy writing desk against the door that connected her room to her father's bedroom, sealing it shut with a permanence that signaled total estrangement. She then installed iron hook locks on the other doors, creating a fortress within the house. The 2nd floor became a grid of barricades. Andrew locked his side, Lizzie locked hers. They lived in a state of siege warfare, separated by inches of plaster and wood, listening to the enemy breathe on the other side of the wall. The environmental conditions of August 1892 turned this claustrophobic layout into a kiln. A heat wave had settled over Fall River, pushing temperatures into the 90s with oppressive humidity. The house, lacking modern ventilation or electric fans, baked in the sun. The windows were often kept shut to keep out the dust and noise of the busy street, trapping the stagnant air inside. The women, trussed up in the heavy, multi-layered wool and corset garments required by Victorian modesty, moved through the sweltering rooms like deep-sea divers, running out of oxygen. The sweat was constant. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene, old wool, and the unspoken resentment that hung like ozone before a storm. And then there was the mutton. The culinary timeline leading up to the murders is a grotesque testament to Andrew Borden's frugality. On Sunday, days before the massacre, the family sat down to a massive roast of mutton. It was a heavy, fatty meal, ill-suited for the blistering heat. In a household with a functioning icebox and a liberal attitude toward waste, the leftovers would have been discarded or consumed quickly. But Andrew Borden did not believe in ice any more than he believed in joy. The family's refrigerator was a simple box in the barn or the cellar, wholly inadequate for preserving meat in tropical temperatures. For the next 3 days, the mutton returned. It appeared on Monday as cold slices. It appeared on Tuesday recooked into a stew. It appeared on Wednesday, arguably now fermenting, as a broth. The meat sat in the sweltering kitchen, cooling and reheating, a perfect petri dish for bacteria. The fat congealed into a gray, waxy film. The smell of old sheep permeated the small dining room, mixing with the heat. Yet under Andrew's glare, the family ate it. To refuse the food would be to insult the provider. The physical consequences were inevitable. By Tuesday night, the entire household was violently ill. Andrew and Abby spent the night vomiting. Lizzie was struck with a bilious attack, a polite Victorian term for intense nausea and dizziness. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, the only person in the house who worked for a wage, likely suffered in silence. The atmosphere in the house shifted from tense to poisonous. They were all sick, dehydrated, and exhausted, trapped in a hot house with no running water to clean themselves, forced to use the slop pails in their rooms while their stomachs turned. This physical sickness added a layer of delirium to the proceedings. When the body is weak, the mind frays. The paranoia that had been simmering for years began to boil over. Abby Borden, clutching her stomach, confided in a neighbor that she believed she had been poisoned. She didn't suspect the rotting mutton. She suspected an assassin. She went to Dr. Bowen, the family physician, claiming that someone was trying to kill them. Andrew, ever the pragmatist, dismissed her fears and the doctor's concern, refusing to pay for a house call and grumbling that it was merely the summer heat, or perhaps the baker's bread. He couldn't accept that his own parsimony was poisoning his blood. The house on the morning of August 4th was a sensory nightmare. The temperature was climbing. The smell of the previous night's sickness lingered in the bedrooms. The doors were locked. The blinds were drawn to save the carpets from the sun, casting the rooms in a gloom. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of Bridget Sullivan washing the outside windows, a task ordered by Abby despite the girl's illness. It was a setting perfectly calibrated for violence. The architecture denied them escape. The heat denied them comfort. The food denied them health. Lizzie Borden sat in this pressure cooker, her head pounding, her stomach churning, listening to the footsteps of the stepmother upstairs. There was nowhere to go. There was no hallway to walk down to clear her head. There was only the wall, the locked door, and the overwhelming, suffocating presence of the people who controlled her life. The house had squeezed them together until there was no space left for air, only space for the swing of a blade. The trap was set, the bait was the family fortune, and the trigger was the sheer, unbearable proximity of their existence, buying freedom with blood. The morning of August 4th, 1892 began with the mundane rhythm of a household that had long ago surrendered to a cold mechanical routine. The sun beat down on the roof of 92 2nd Street, promising a day of suffocating heat. Inside, the air was already stale. At the breakfast table, Andrew and Abby Borden picked at their meal, likely the remnants of the mutton, before Andrew prepared for his daily pilgrimage to the bank. He put on his heavy black coat, a garment entirely unsuited for the weather, and stepped out into the humid street at exactly 9 a.m. He left behind a house that was ostensibly secure, locked from the inside with 3 women remaining within its walls: his wife Abby, his daughter Lizzie, and the Irish maid Bridget Sullivan. By the time he returned 90 minutes later, the hierarchy of the home would be permanently dismantled by a blade. The timeline of the carnage suggests a precision that contradicts the chaotic nature of the wounds. The violence began shortly after Andrew left. Abby Borden, the heavy, slow-moving stepmother, went upstairs to the guest room to tidy the bed linens. It was a chore she didn't need to do. Bridget could have done it. But in a house of boredom, small tasks became significant. She was standing between the bed and the dressing bureau, a narrow trap of furniture, when the killer entered. The forensic evidence tells a story of an ambush. Abby was facing her attacker at the moment of the first strike. The hatchet caught her on the side of the head, a blow of such force that it spun her heavy frame around and sent her crashing face down onto the floor. She was helpless, trapped between the bedpost and the dresser. What followed was not a murder. It was an erasure. The killer stood over the prone woman and brought the hatchet down 18 more times. The blade hacked into the back of her skull, pulverizing the bone and driving fragments into the brain. The strikes were not efficient. They were repetitive, clustered in a tight grouping that suggests a singular, blinding focus on destroying the identity of the victim. There were no defensive wounds on Abby's hands. She never had a chance to fight. She simply ceased to exist, her blood soaking into the carpet, pooling around her head like a dark halo. Then the house fell silent. This is the detail that transforms the Borden case from a crime of passion into a study of psychopathy. For the next hour and a half, the killer remained in the house with the corpse. There was no flight. There was no panic. Lizzie Borden remained downstairs. She spoke to Bridget Sullivan, who was washing the windows outside. She told Bridget that Mrs. Borden had received a note and gone out to visit a sick friend. It was a lie delivered with the calm assurance of a sociopath. Lizzie moved through the rooms, perhaps ironing handkerchiefs, perhaps eating a pear, all while the body of her stepmother lay cooling in the guest room directly above the parlor. The ability to maintain a facade of domestic normalcy while standing 20 feet away from a fresh homicide suggests a nervous system completely detached from human empathy. At 10:40 a.m., the lock turned in the front door. Andrew Borden was home early. He had felt unwell at the bank. The mutton was still wreaking havoc on his digestion, and decided to return for a rest. The front door, heavily bolted by Andrew's own paranoia, was jammed. Bridget Sullivan heard him fumbling with the key and went to let him in. As she struggled with the triple locks, she heard a sound from the top of the stairs, a soft, low laugh. It was Lizzie, standing on the landing, looking down. She was standing mere feet from the room where Abby lay dead, laughing at her father's struggle to enter his own fortress. Andrew walked in, unaware that he was stepping into a tomb. He asked for Abby. Lizzie repeated the lie. She had a note. She went out. Andrew, tired and sick, accepted this without question. He went into the sitting room and lay down on the horsehair sofa for a nap. He removed his boots. He rested his head on a cushion. He closed his eyes. It was the posture of a man who felt completely safe, protected by his locks and his money. The second attack occurred roughly 15 minutes later. The killer entered the sitting room while Andrew slept. This time, the fury was focused on the face. The first blow likely killed him instantly, but the hatchet continued to fall. 11 times the blade struck, turning the banker's face into a ruin of bone and tissue. One blow was so violent it sliced his left eyeball in half, popping it like a grape. Another severed his nose. The attacks were centered on his sensory organs, his eyes, his nose, his ears, as if the killer wanted to stop him from ever seeing, smelling, or hearing the world again. The blood spray was directional, fanning out onto the wall and the picture frames. But Andrew's body did not move. He died as he had lived, rigid, cold, and alone. At 11:10 a.m., the silence was broken. Lizzie Borden shouted for the maid. "Maggie, come down. Father's dead. Someone came in and killed him." When Dr. Bowen and the police arrived, they found a scene that defied the logic of their small town. The contrast was absolute. The Victorian parlor, with its heavy drapes and stiff furniture, was now a slaughterhouse. Andrew Borden, the man who controlled the economy of Fall River, was reduced to a heap of bloody clothes on a sofa. His pockets were still full of cash and keys. Nothing had been stolen. The gold watch was in his vest. The diamond ring was on his finger. This was not a robbery. The behavior of Lizzie Borden in the immediate aftermath was forensically peculiar. She did not weep. She did not faint. She sat in a chair, her hands fluttering slightly, her breathing even. When the police asked her where she had been, she offered a series of shifting, nonsensical answers. "I was in the barn looking for sinkers. I was in the yard eating a pear. I was ironing." She had changed her dress. The police, blinded by the class prejudices of the era, handled her with kid gloves. They allowed her to retire to her room. They did not search her person for blood. They did not immediately search the house for the weapon. They simply could not process the idea that a woman of her station, a Borden, could wield a hatchet with such devastating force. It was not until later that the body of Abby Borden was discovered upstairs. The blood had already congealed, the skin was cold. The medical examiner realized the timeline immediately. Abby had died hours before Andrew. This fact shattered the theory of an outside intruder. A maniac from the street would not kill a woman, hide in a closet for 90 minutes without making a sound, and then emerge to kill the man. The killer had to be someone who belonged in the house, someone who could wait comfortably in the silence between the screams. The illusion of the Borden dynasty collapsed in that sitting room. The 19 blows to Abby and the 11 blows to Andrew had done more than end 2 lives. They had cracked open the walls of 92 2nd Street, allowing the world to peer inside. The neighbors, the police, and the press crowded onto the lawn, hungry for details. They expected to find a story of a burglar or a madman. Instead, they found a story of a locked house, a missing will, and a daughter with dry eyes who stood amidst the carnage of her parents and looked at the police with the same flat, impenetrable stare that her father had used to deny a loan. The bank vault had been breached, but the money was safe. It was the people who were broken. The Gilded Cage, Maplecroft, and the Lonely End. The trial of Lizzie Borden in June of 1893 was not a legal proceeding so much as a collision between the brutality of the forensic evidence and the fragility of Victorian gender norms. The prosecution presented the skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden. They presented the timeline, and they presented the impossibility of an intruder. But the defense presented Lizzie. They dressed her in black silk, gave her a fan to hide her face, and seated her in front of a jury comprised entirely of middle-aged men. These men looked at the Sunday school teacher, the daughter of a bank president, and they simply could not reconcile her image with the carnage in the photos. To convict her would be to admit that a woman of their own class could be capable of such primitive violence. On June 20th, after only 1 hour of deliberation, the foreman delivered the verdict, not guilty. Lizzie Borden did not cheer. She slumped into her chair, wept for a moment, and then stood up. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman. But the true transaction of the Borden tragedy was just beginning. The verdict unlocked the one thing Lizzie had killed for: the inheritance. With Andrew and Abby dead and no will found to contradict the laws of succession, the entire Borden estate, the bank accounts, the rental properties, the commercial blocks, passed to Lizzie and Emma. The sisters inherited a fortune valued at approximately $350,000. In today's currency, they were instantly multimillionaires. The locks that Andrew Borden had placed on his money were shattered. The first thing Lizzie did was to execute the escape plan she had harbored for decades. She did not return to the house on 2nd Street. She never stepped foot in the slaughterhouse again. 5 weeks after the acquittal, Lizzie purchased a sprawling 14-room Queen Anne Victorian mansion in the most fashionable district of Fall River, The Hill. It was the precise address she had always coveted, high above the soot and the noise of the mills, surrounded by the homes of the city's elite. She named the house Maplecroft. She carved the name into the stone steps, a declaration of her new identity. She furnished the house with everything her father had denied her. She bought oil paintings, heavy velvet drapes, and mahogany furniture. She hired a staff of servants, a chauffeur, and a gardener. She installed electricity, modern plumbing, and a telephone. She bought a limousine. She draped herself in furs and jewelry, spending the coffin money with a frantic, hungry energy. She had won. She had the house, the money, and the freedom. But Fall River had its own verdict, and it was not delivered by a jury. The community knew what had happened in that sitting room. They knew that 19 blows do not happen by accident. While the law could not touch her, the rumor engine of the town began to construct a new prison around her, one made of silence and ice. Lizzie Borden became a social leper. The neighbors on the hill, the very people she was desperate to join, closed their curtains when her limousine drove past. When she walked into the Central Congregational Church for Sunday service, a ripple of movement would pass through the congregation. Families would quietly stand up and move to different pews, leaving a circle of empty space around her. She sat alone in her expensive clothes, surrounded by a perimeter of judgment. Eventually, the pressure became too great, and she stopped attending church altogether. The Sunday school teacher was effectively excommunicated by the silence of her peers. The isolation deepened. The children of Fall River, emboldened by the whispers of their parents, would gather outside the gates of Maplecroft. They threw gravel at her windows. They rang the doorbell and ran away. They chanted the rhyme that would become her legacy, a cruel nursery song that reduced the massacre to a playground taunt. Lizzie would sit behind her heavy drapes, listening to the voices of the children, calling her a murderer. She had escaped the physical prison of her father's house, but she was now trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. The only person who had stood by her, her sister Emma, eventually broke. For years, Emma had defended Lizzie, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear. But the weight of the secret, combined with Lizzie's ostentatious lifestyle, cracked the bond. In 1905, after a fierce argument, rumored to be about a party Lizzie threw for a troupe of theatrical actors, a class of people Andrew Borden would have despised, Emma packed her bags and left Maplecroft. She moved to New Hampshire and never spoke to Lizzie again. The sisters lived the rest of their lives in absolute silence, carrying the truth of August 1892 to their graves. Left alone in the mansion, Lizzie's world shrank to the size of her property line. She became a phantom in her own home. She surrounded herself with animals, perhaps because they were the only living things that did not look at her with suspicion. She raised Boston Terriers. She built elaborate houses for the squirrels in the backyard, feeding them peanuts by hand. The woman accused of hacking human beings to death became a tender guardian of stray dogs. It was a grotesque paradox. She lavished her love on creatures that could not judge her, while the human world outside her gates regarded her as a monster. As she aged, the silent madness that had fueled the crime settled into a dull, heavy eccentricity. She grew obese, her body expanding to fill the space left by her isolation. She spent her days traveling between the different rooms of Maplecroft, moving from the library to the parlor, sitting in chairs that no guest ever occupied. She had servants, but no friends. She had money, but nowhere to go. The fortune of Andrew Borden bought her comfort, but it could not buy her a single conversation that wasn't paid for. In 1927, at the age of 66, Lizzie Andrew Borden died of pneumonia. She died in the master bedroom of Maplecroft, surrounded by her paid staff. The news of her death swept through Fall River, but it elicited no mourning. It was merely the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written 35 years earlier. The funeral was a stark illustration of her reality. There was no public service. There was no eulogy. She was buried under the cover of night in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery. The irony of her final resting place is profound. She was lowered into the earth mere feet away from the bodies of Andrew and Abby Borden. In death, the family was reunited. The father who hoarded the money, the stepmother who was hacked to pieces, and the daughter who wielded the blade were laid side by side, bound together for eternity in the cold New England ground. Her will revealed the final trajectory of her heart. She left $30,000 to the Animal Rescue League of Fall River. She left money to her servants. She left nothing to the city that had hated her. Today, Maplecroft still stands on the hill, and the house on 2nd Street operates as a bed and breakfast, where tourists pay to sleep in the room where Abby died. The Borden name has become a tourist attraction, a macabre joke printed on T-shirts and coffee mugs. But the forensic reality of the case remains a sobering study of cause and effect. Andrew Borden built a pressure cooker out of greed and control. He tried to defy the laws of human nature, believing he could starve his family of love and dignity without consequence. He was wrong. The hatchet was not a random act of evil. It was the inevitable explosion of a suppressed life. Lizzie Borden got away with murder, but she served a life sentence nonetheless, a sentence of silence, served in a beautiful empty house with only the ghosts of her parents and the squirrels on the lawn to keep her company.